Okay, so hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are very pleased to welcome you to the data collection webinar series, which is organized by the Data and Analytics section at UNICEF headquarters in New York. And today is our first webinar in a new series in this spring 2022 series, or the webinars. I am Attila Hanjoğlu. I am the chief of the data collection unit at UNICEF headquarters. This series of webinars is organized by topic, as opposed to by data collection method, as it was in the past webinars. We will focus on data collection methods that can be used to generate data on a specific topic, and we will be covering topics that have recently gained relevance or importance, and where there's ongoing work on how best to collect the data for the topic. Topics such as the consensual approach to poverty measurement, as we're covering today, as well as adolescent mental health, ICT for children, child food insecurity, and bullying. Those will be the topics of the upcoming webinars. So before we begin, let me mention some housekeeping points. We have scheduled about an hour today. As always, throughout the webinar, please remain muted. Kindly write your questions in the chat box. We will try to group your questions and direct them to the presenters during the Q&A. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on our SharePoint site, as well as the mixed YouTube channel, which means that we have the webinar available internally as well as publicly. You can also find the past webinars both on our SharePoint site and the YouTube channel. Today's webinar is entitled The Consensual Approach, Collecting Better Data to Measure Child and Family Poverty. And at this point, I will now pass it over to Enrique Delamónica, who will be chairing the session. Enrique, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Attila. I will not take a lot of time, just to introduce the two presenters, Shailen, Nandy, and David Gordon, both distinguished professors and renowned researchers in the field of poverty, and specifically on child poverty. David Gordon is the director of the Townsend Center for International Poverty Research and professor of social justice at the University of Bristol. And Shailen Nandy is professor of international social policy in the School of Social Sciences at Cardiff University. They are both joined by a good friend of ours, Gwyther Rees, who, among many other accomplishments, is currently working for our Office of Research in Innocenti in Florence. So welcome to all three of you. Please, Dave and Shailen, you can start.
Okay, I'm going to start and give a quick presentation, and then Shailen is going to fill in a lot of the details I'm going to just skip over. So I will share my screen and slides. Okay, I'm going to... Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about collecting better data to measure child and family poverty. This is a project we're currently developing about new data collection, which has the following aims: to develop a new international survey module using existing data from microdata from almost 50 countries and existing focus group data with a range of participants from about 20 countries. Once we've developed a short question module, we'll then pilot it, hopefully in a survey such as the Gallup World Poll or Mix Plus or similar survey. And this will produce the first high quality, directly comparable, easy to understand estimates of multidimensional child poverty in all countries of the world, not just low income, but also middle and high income. Once we have got a module which we believe works, we'll then develop the instructions for enumerators and disseminate it, and then hopefully we'll move on to new consensual deprivation data collection once it's been accepted. So that's the... So why is this new data collection needed? Why should we do this? Well, if we go back to the history of measuring child poverty with UNICEF, Jan van der Mutele was one of the main key architects in designing the Millennium Development Goals at the turn of the century. But there was no international requirement in the Millennium Development Goals to measure child poverty per se. That didn't come into existence until the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in 2015. Jan wanted to include child poverty in the MDGs when he was developing them in 2000, or before 2000, but there simply wasn't sufficient knowledge at that time about how to measure child poverty to make this proposal feasible. The countries of the world would not have adopted it. Child poverty measurement at that time, at the end of the last century, usually treated children as a property of their households rather than trying to measure the poverty of children directly. So UNICEF, at the end of the last century, commissioned a team at the University of Bristol and London School of Economics, my late lamented colleague Peter Townsend, to develop a new measure of child poverty. Jan was working for UNICEF by then, and Enrique and Alberto Manuchin were heavily involved in it. This project had the following requirements. It must be based on internationally agreed definitions of poverty. The measure must be consistent with the human rights framework, particularly the UNCRC, with children being the object of the measurement. It should be age and gender appropriate and reflect the changing needs of children as they grow up. It should be based on existing and available, i.e. no-cost survey data. It should measure child poverty in low-income countries and wasn't aimed for middle and high-income countries. And the primary purpose of this was an advocacy tool to move child poverty up the policy agenda, given the experience of the MDGs, and to get UNICEF in the room with governments when anti-poverty policies were being debated. So the method needed to be clear and simple enough for politicians and the public to understand. And the methodology that we developed, myself and Shailen and others, became known as the Bristol Method. It drew upon 100 years of research in Europe into deprivation measures, but also independent research since the 1970s in Latin America on unmet basic needs deprivation measures. And the child was the centre, and I'm sure that many of you know about the Bristol methodology. I'm not going to go into the details of it. It facilitated UNICEF's first ever study, and so far only study, global study of child poverty and disparities, which ran in over 50 countries. Solo and many other people who are still working for UNICEF played leading roles in advocating and disseminating this to country offices. And country offices use these reports based on the Bristol methodology to achieve significant change in a number of countries. For example, this was the work done by UNICEF in China. The Chinese government, after this work was done, wrote child poverty into their next 5-year plan for the first time. Before that, children were just treated as the property of their household. So it was very successful. UNICEF argued that the research transformed the way UNICEF and many of its partners understood and measured the poverty suffered by children, and as a consequence, children were more visible in poverty reduction policies and debates. It also generated a lot of academic research. The UNICEF Office of Research developed the methodology to produce MODA. Our colleagues at the University of Oxford produced the MPI. aggregating basically a similar basket of deprivation indicators using different methodologies. Again, that's not the purpose of this talk at the moment. So, if it was successful, if it got helped facilitate child poverty to be included in the SDGs, it helped facilitate the UN to adopt its first ever definition of child poverty, it was used widely. What's the problem? Why do we need new data to be collected? Well, the problem is there's no global measure of child poverty which can be used in all countries at the moment, in low, middle and high income countries. None of the indicators used in the Bristol Method or in MODA or OPMPI are designed to measure child and family poverty. And it's impossible in many countries to create a reliable measure of child poverty using just these indicators, irrespective of how you aggregate the indicators. Valid and reliable child and family multidimensional poverty measurement in the 21st century requires the collection of some new data specifically designed to measure poverty in order to both supplement and complement traditional deprivation indicators that are collected in the mix in DHS and used widely. So we need new data if we want to have a truly global measure of child poverty to add to what we already have, not to replace it. So we believe this can be done using what's called the Consensual Methodology, which has been developed continuously for over 40 years, and Shailen will talk about the more details in his talk. It can be possible to use this method to produce comparable and meaningful poverty measures, which can be used in all countries, despite the vast difference in living standards and cultures across the world. So, for example, in Luxembourg, a person may be considered to be poor if they don't have access to the internet, whereas in Liberia, a poor person may be someone who can't afford even soap or basic toiletries. So in order to have global measures of child and family poverty, there are certain requisites to ensure that the measure is valid, reliable and meaningful. So firstly, you need a theory and definition of poverty, which is universally applicable in all societies at all points in time. Secondly, you need a method which will automatically adapt to measure the realities of the lives of poor people in the country society where they live. No group of people has knowledge of poverty in all cultures, in all societies. The method needs to be self-adapting. You need a method which can produce comparable estimates of the extent and depth of poverty, even where different questions, or at least some different questions and indicators are being used in different countries and for different age groups. You want questions for children to be age and gender appropriate. You also want questions for adults to be age and gender appropriate. So you may have slightly different question set. You also need a method which demonstrably produces valid and reliable measurement. You need to be able to prove that these things are comparable, valid and reliable. So over the past 2 decades, there have been a number of methodological and measurement advances, and we now have an analytical framework which has been repeatedly evaluated by expert groups, by the Eurostat, the European Statistical Office, the UNECE, the Conference of European Statisticians, the UN Expert Group on Poverty Statistics, the Pacific Methods Group of National Statisticians have all endorsed this methodology. And Eurostat's expert task force on deprivation measurement has argued the work is considered to be technically as providing a gold standard and has unanimous support, and was written into European Union law by the 40 legislatures in the 28 member states that existed at that time, having to satisfy all of the experts for those legislatures. It's also been adopted by the 30 Pacific Island countries. Consensual deprivation, data collection method and acceptability. So consensual deprivation question modules have been continuously developed since the 1980s and successfully used in both government and academic studies in all regions of the world. Respondents and interviewers' reports are usually very positive from the data collection. Respondents believe that these questions are important and they have very low refusal non-response rates, even in countries which have notoriously high non-response rates. You rarely, if ever, get people refusing to answer these questions. Interviewer feedback is that respondents understand the questions. They're simple and easy to understand, and they address the realities of people's lives in that country. And they believe that the answers that respondents give are likely to be correct and describe their circumstances. So we get good feedback from both respondents and interviewers, and there's good feedback from cognitive interviewing. The deprivation question modules have also been developed for use with interviews with children, not just with adults talking about children, and they've been successfully used in a wide range of countries. And lastly, consensual deprivation question modules have been successfully used in a wide range of interview settings with a wide range of different modes of data collection. Paper, face-to-face interviewing, CAPI, computer-assisted personal interviewing, CATI, computer-assisted telephone interviewing, and CAWI interviewing with computer-assisted interviewing over the web. So here's an example of what happens if you have different modes of data collection. These are the modes of data collection used by the European and other EU member states and other European countries for collecting the SILT data. Some countries collect 100% of the data using CAPI. Some countries use self-administered questionnaires or paper-assisted interviewing to collect 100% of the data, and some countries use a wide range of different methods to collect the data simultaneously. So the question is, how do child and adult poverty results change if you've got this whole plethora of different modes of data collection? Because if you've got vastly different results with different modes of data collection, that could be problematic given the different ways the data are collected around the world. Well, we did some measurement invariance research, and what you do get is partial scalar measurement invariance. What does that mean? It means that a score of 2 in Germany and Bulgaria is almost the same, but not quite the same, because of these different modes of data collection. And their problems, the stars show problems with the different deprivation questions in different countries. If you just select the subset of countries which use the same modes of data collection, then you get almost full scalar invariance. So the score of 5 on the deprivation index in Belgium means the same as it does in France or Luxembourg or Portugal, which is your ultimate. Now, this is not surprising that different modes of data collection can lead to different results. We compared the results of the deprivation module questions collection with other demographic variables. Sex was more scalar invariant, it was better measured, but age group was more poorly measured. So we can measure deprivation using consensual deprivation irrespective of the data collection method, as well as we can measure age, but not as well as we can measure gender or sex. So let me conclude. Valid, reliable and meaningful child and family poverty measures are needed by policymakers in order to provide them with the information they require to develop and implement effective and efficient anti-poverty policies, and to evaluate the results of these policies to see if the policies are working or not. And given the devastating impact of the pandemic on increasing child poverty around the world, we need better, more efficient and effective anti-poverty policies. And we also need better data to help politicians to develop those policies and evaluate them. There are currently no valid and reliable global measures of child poverty. The Bristol Method and its derivatives only effectively measure severe child poverty in the poorest countries, and most poor children don't live in the poorest countries. Most middle and high-income countries mainly use income poverty measures which treat children as properties of their households, even today. New data collection using the consensual deprivation question module can provide child and family poverty data required to complement existing deprivation indicators and facilitate valid, reliable and comparable child and family poverty measurement. It's a low-cost solution to a really important problem. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. Very interesting points, both in terms of the substance of what we want to measure, but also on how and the kind of questions and methods we can get to get the proper answers to what we want to measure. Shailen, your turn, please. Over.
Grant, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. I'm going to try and share my screen and hope I can do it competently.
It seems to work.
It's working? Fantastic. Great. Well, thank you, Archana, Attila, Enrique, and everyone involved in this seminar series. I think, and also it's nice to see so many familiar names in the audience from around the world. It's great to see colleagues with whom we're already collaborating, in part using the consensual approach, involved in sitting in on this. So some of what I'll be saying may be familiar to some of you. Hopefully it will not be too boring, but Dave has outlined nicely, quite clearly, the why we need, or why we think we need, a better way of collecting data, or better data for children. And so what I'm going to be focusing on today is necessarily a little bit, be focusing more a bit about the what is the consensual approach for those of you who are maybe not as familiar with it, and also given the focus on data collection, on the how the data are collected and how they've been collected in the different countries and used that way. Okay. I should say all of my slides, I'm happy to, I've shared them with Archana, and hopefully she will share them with everyone there. And that we've put a whole link to sort of relevant resources that cover the theory and the methodological elements for people if they want to follow up. Everything is open access and could be got. But if you are interested in following up more about the consensual approach, I've placed in this slide a link to the poverty website that we archive everything, not just about the poverty studies around the world, but also on the methods development and all of the background materials there, questionnaires, for example, which were used in the UK's poverty and social exclusion study from 2012. Okay, so before, in case I run out of time, I always find it useful to begin with the simple key messages that we're hoping everyone will take away from these from these types of talks. The first is, obviously we all are interested in poverty and child poverty, particularly with the UNICEF audience. Well, the consensual approach can deliver and can develop measures and indicators that meet the requirements of the Sustainable Development Goal that focuses on multidimensional poverty. So what the CA enables is child and adult relevant indicators of deprivation, and also importantly, using national definitions of what these deprivations entail and what national definitions of poverty require reporting on. The methodology, as Dave has highlighted, has been well established and used across low, middle and high income country settings. And countries, colleagues with whom we've been working have been able to add short modules of questions to existing survey platforms like the income and expenditure surveys, even the DHS, but also household budget surveys as well. And ideally, we would marry the deprivations indicator with the income and expenditure data for different national surveys. The measure of material deprivation or multidimensional poverty that is developed using the consensual approach, or the deprivation index produced from the consensual approach, has been shown to be highly reliable and valid as well. And I'll have a slide towards the end that sort of really looks into the difference between an index based on a simple lack of an item versus an index based on an enforced lack of an item, or an item that people lack not because they choose not to have a television or a radio, but they don't have one because they report they cannot afford it. And that's a very important distinguishing difference that we need to be aware of and clear on. The different item lists can be tailored for different country settings and still remain comparable. And I'm sure we can discuss that later on. And that, I mean, I think we'll all agree there are better and more direct measures of multidimensional poverty for children that we can develop, that they are needed, and that with the existing survey platforms available to all of us, that integrating something like this would be really handy in terms of reporting towards the SDGs, but also for policy and program purposes. Okay, so a little bit about what is the consensual approach. It's effectively a method for defining a minimum acceptable way of life by setting out or getting an agreement within societies and across societies on what the necessities of life are. What are these socially perceived necessities that everyone thinks everyone in their country for that time and that place should be able to have or be able to do? Okay, so the general public, the approach entails using a mix of qualitative and quantitative methods, including asking the general public through focus groups, through cognitive interviews, and for nationally representative surveys, in conjunction with expert opinion and established social norms, asking all of these different groups about what the necessities of life for a minimum standard of living or an acceptable standard of living should be. And households or respondents who say they have an enforced lack, i.e. they lack something because they cannot afford them, can be said to be living in poverty. And this distinction is important because we're trying to identify a lack not through choice, but through a lack of resources. Okay, the example is given here. Urban residents may not own or need a car, a private car, because in urban areas you do have better public transport available to people. Okay, so I lack one not because I don't want one, but because I don't need one, effectively, because there are good alternatives there. So that's a little bit about what the consensual approach is. It's asking people to identify democratically, one might say, what everyone should be able to have in society today. And this will change over time, unsurprisingly. How do we do this? A flow chart here from Peter Saunders and Melissa Wong's work in Australia really helps set things out quite clearly, I find. We ask participants in the survey, or having used focus groups and cognitive interviews, to come up with a list of items which they think should be asked about in each country. Respondents in the national survey are asked 2 or 3 very simple questions. They're asked from this list of items what they consider to be necessities that no one should be able to go without, that necessities which no one should have to be without because of a lack of resources or due to insufficient resources. And so if you could have a list of, say, I don't know, 15, 20 items, we ask a question, do you have it? Sorry, is it essential, yes or no? If we've got that first dotted line down to the essentials of life, if a majority of the population consider item X to be essential, then one might include this as an item as a socially perceived necessity or an essential. So you'd have a list of, sort of, out of 10 items, over half of the population identify 8 of these items to be essential. The second main question is, do you then have it, or does your household have this item? And if they do, fantastic. But if they don't, we need a follow-up last question. Is it because you cannot afford it? Or is it because you don't want it in some variations of the thing? And over here, what Peter Saunders and Melissa Wong identified was this enforced lack. You lack a socially perceived necessity because you cannot afford it, is the essence of deprivation and therefore the link to poverty. So these different items would reflect the different dimensions when we're talking about multidimensional poverty. Tony Atkinson's report set out a reasonable starting point of which dimensions to consider, and these are reflected in pretty much every internationally agreed definition of poverty. focusing on nutrition, health status, education, housing, and all those different elements. And the good news is that for 40 years, studies using the consensual approach have already covered many of these domains, which I've listed here. I won't go through them all, but importantly, many of these domains, for whether it's clothing, whether it's diet, we do ask questions separately for the needs of children and for the needs of adults separately. Ideally, and in some countries, they have been asking children themselves as to what do they think are the necessities of life for children. And so there's certainly scope for including children's voices in the process. Here are a couple of examples of items that have been asked for both children and adults. This is for some work done in the Solomon Islands and the Kingdom of Tonga, where questions have been added to, I think it's the DHS or the HES data there. So you can see elements like clothes, like shoes, special clothes for special functions or occasions. These are important social participation elements that need to be reflected in any consideration of multidimensional poverty. There are social obligations that people are expected to meet. And so being able to reflect these, such as gift giving or or presents for children on special events, or like at present at Eid, gift giving at Eid is very, very important in many countries. Being able to reflect households and people's capacity to meet these social obligations is important and are reflected in the consensual approach and the items about which we ask. And I've said there, the list of items here is indicative and is modifiable for each country in different context. I mean, I showed you the Solomon Islands and Tonga, quite different countries. In Korea, in South Korea, some work which we've been doing with colleagues there. There is every 4 or 5 years, there's the Korean National Child Survey that again also asks very similar questions as well, applying to different age groups within Korean society. Interestingly, the questionnaire for this particular survey didn't ask respondents whether they thought items were necessities or not. But again, it's easily enough to modify and to include a set of questions asking about whether people think these are essential or not, and then linking it to whether people lack them because they can't afford them as well. So this is South Korea. I've got a couple more examples of where it's been done with colleagues. I see colleagues on the call from Uganda, and my greetings to everyone there. In the Uganda National Household Survey, here again, we had items for children. I'm just showing the ones for children, but we also had items for all household members and adults as well. Again, very similar items, asking whether or not something is essential and whether or not they have it or lack it because they can't afford it or because they don't have it for another reason, for example. So when we get over 50% of the population agreeing that, say, for example, 3 meals a day is essential, then it's important to know what proportion of people or children are lacking these items because families can't afford them. And it is instructive when you see the different degrees of measures of food security, for example, or dietary diversity, which give much lower levels of deprivation compared to whether or not children are able to have 3 meals a day, or meat or protein once or twice a week, or fresh fruit and vegetables once or twice a week as well. You get very different pictures of the state of food insecurity in some countries. Now, the consensual approach, as the name suggests, is reliant on whether or not there is consensus across societies about what constitutes an acceptable minimum standard of living. And so is there evidence of such consensus? Now, we thought, okay, there are great data sets that we've done, but we thought, let's double check with other existing data sets if we could demonstrate that there is, in fact, agreement across different countries about what is an acceptable minimum. And some of you will be familiar with the core welfare indicator questionnaires, the EMICOV or the CWIQ surveys, which were run in the mid-2000s in several countries in West Africa. And so the two questions that are asked there is, do you feel that, and from a list of standard items, are necessary to maintain a minimum standard of living? And the second follow-up question, which we've taken sort of question 2 as the conceptual equivalence of satisfaction, the conceptual equivalence of lacking because you cannot afford it is, are you satisfied that your household meets its minimum needs? And then it was not at all was the response category that we used, assuming that if you felt that your needs were being met and you've been able to afford to feel them, then you wouldn't feel that they were not at all met, if that makes any sense. And so what we did for these 4 or 5 countries in West Africa where we've had the data was to be able to say, look, what are the proportions in each of these countries that look in, say, a consumption domain or a food domain, health domain, issues like having being able to own at least 2 pairs of shoes or having a radio. In the food domain, eating fresh meat or eating vegetables and fish every day. The only place, and sorry, you can see from the perpendicular line in the left-hand panel, that's the 50% or more threshold, that in pretty much all of the items that we have here across these different domains, there's only one instance where less than half the population in Gabon felt that eating cereals or tubers were necessities for a minimum standard of living. There is widespread agreement across countries about a whole range of things. And you'd think it would be obvious, right? Having access to electricity, water, these are all important things that we would all want access to. But there are also subnational agreement and agreement across social groups. So this is for Liberia, Mali, and Benin. When you've got a wide horizontal bar, it shows the degree of difference between those the group, say the age group least likely to think something is important compared to the most important. And so for age, you can see the biggest difference there is for being able to have at least 2 changes of clothes or at least 2 pairs of shoes. But generally the bars are quite close together, and in no instances do we see any of the bars stretching across the red perpendicular line, reflecting that 50% cutoff in each instance. So we're seeing consensus across countries and now in a subnational context and also across social groups within very heterogeneous countries in West Africa. So yes, consensus is clear and there are high levels of support for all these very basic items that everyone should be able to have for a decent standard of living. But what about this issue of bounded horizons or so-called adaptive preferences? Is it the case that if you asked someone raised in poverty what they think everyone should have, that their thoughts about what everyone should be able to have will be less that or lower than for someone who has been raised in conditions of plenty? Okay, and the example is usually given when people study aspirations for salaries. And it's not surprising that someone who doesn't have an education, who might not have an education or a low education, may realize quite reasonably and rationally that their chances of having a higher salary compared to someone with a university degree or a high school education is less. But when it comes to thinking what people think everyone should be able to have, and we've tested it with several validators of standard of individual and proxy wealth, that we see that there's very rarely, if ever, any significant difference between the groups as to what is important for everybody in society. So I've put links to all of these different papers in the notes sections for all of these if you want to read more. But these were giving the examples of Benin and Mali, showing that in many instances there was in almost all instances, there was no significant difference between what the well-off and the less well-off thought were important for a decent minimum standard of living. So, are countries and communities in agreement? Is there consensus? Most definitely, yes. The different items that have been used or been tested reflect many of the different dimensions of multidimensional poverty, and the bounded horizons or adaptive preferences element does not undermine the validity of the approach, of the consensual approach in particular. And we've done recently in the last 4 or 5 years, we've done studies using the consensual approach with refugee and refugee hosting communities in Uganda, with UNICEF Uganda over there. We've done work with universities in Brazil in running the consensual approach in low-income favela communities, pre-COVID and during COVID. And also colleagues have used the approach in across the city of Buenos Aires in Argentina as well, all with comparable results and sort of experience on which to gain, on which to build. Now, I mentioned earlier this issue of a simple lack versus an enforced lack. When you build up all of our DHS surveys, all of our mix, ask households, do you have a TV? Do you have a radio? Do you have X, Y, or Z? And they're very often it's a yes or no. That would be a series of no's would mean an index based on a simple lack, whereas an enforced lack taps into that I lack it because I can't afford it, not because I don't want it. And my colleague Rod Hick conducted an in-depth assessment of data using the consensual approach in the UK to compare whether or not a simple lack versus an enforced lack, which was more accurate, I suppose. And he concluded, he had several conclusions. First was that the enforced lack was a significantly greater degree of reliability than a simple absence index or a simple lack index. He noted that there was a greater level of validity on subjective dimensions of deprivation using the enforced lack, and that there were more, I'm trying to find the correct verb, then enforced lack measures discriminate better or more effectively in terms of whether households were able to save, whether or not there was unemployment in the household, the different housing problems such as damp or overcrowding that they faced, as also linked to a subjective measure of financial stress. So this enforced lack, this question that says, are you able to have it because, are you lacking it because you cannot afford it, is a very, very important addition that we think needs to be added. And Rod's conclusion was that there was little to suggest that the index of simple absence of items would be preferable to one based on the enforced lack criterion. So he really went into detail to see which would be the better way of going about it, an enforced lack versus a simple lack, and he came down in favor of the enforced lack. So my last slide here is to say the consensual approach does have a clear justification for why the indicators are selected and used. It goes beyond income data to look at deprivations or real important deprivations for adults and children separately. It does reflect the experiences of the poor by including them in the national surveys to ascertain what is important, what is a necessity. And in doing so, it reflects sort of the reality of societies in which it is applied. Children's items for children can reflect age-appropriate standards. And as I've said before, given the examples here from Tonga, the Solomon Islands, Uganda, and Korea, it's applicable across low, middle, and high-income country settings, enabling some degree of international comparison. I've placed some useful resources there from sort of open access journals and the PSE website, the poverty.ac.uk website. And I'm looking forward to sort of discussions and conversations with colleagues. My contact details are on the start of the slide, and if anyone is interested in playing in the future, please do feel free to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Shailen, very, very much. Among the many good points you made, the importance of listening to children, and also from the data collection point of view, the fact that there are these wealth of questions that have been used throughout countries, and they are reliable, they are valid, they provide good information, and you showed some of those questions that are sort of ready-made for data collection. That's good. Gwyther, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Enrique, and thank you, Dave and Shailen. It was a great presentation. Enrique, how long would you like me to speak for? I have to leave at 3 or in 13 minutes anyway, but would you like me to be briefer than that?
I would say yes, make all the points you have to make, and make sure that you make your next appointment. And if you can do all of that and leaving some space for a couple of questions, that would be fantastic. But take your time, say everything you need to say.
I'll do my best. Okay, well, first of all, just to say, give you a little bit about my background and my involvement in similar work. I worked in the UK for a long time, and along with Professor Jonathan Bradshaw in the UK, we initiated a type of consensual approach project for child poverty in the UK. It was done by an excellent researcher, Jill Main, and produced a child-defined child deprivation index for the UK at that point. I can put the journal article in the chat if you're interested in And then I was involved in an international study called Children's Worlds, which gathered data from children eventually in 35 countries around the world, countries as different as Norway and Nepal, for example. And we implemented something similar to the approach we developed in the UK and then adjusted it in discussion with children in about 20 countries. I wouldn't call this a full consensual approach, but it does have some elements that are similar in its principles. So I know that the main brief is to talk about data collection, so I can start with that and then make a few other points about utility and theory and so on. But on the data collection points, one important thing that we found in the UK, and we didn't verify anywhere else because it requires matched data from parents and children, is that once you construct an index like this, there is a very high level of agreement between parents and children about whether the child has those items. Very, very high, sort of 98% agreement. Doesn't mean that children are right, but it means that they're not any more wrong than their parents. So I think we can be confident, because people often ask, can children report accurately on these things? And with things like this, yes, they can, I believe. At least that's what we know from the UK for children from about the age of 10. But before that, we had done a focus group approach with children, and I'd just like to reflect a bit on that because again it's relevant to data collection. I think one of the challenges I see in running focus groups on this is, and I see this in a lot of the literature on child poverty, is the concept becomes very, very fluid and the boundaries become very, very wide. So as researchers, we may have a predefined notion of what poverty is and what it isn't. And poverty researchers don't agree with each other on these things. But once you take that out to people who haven't studied poverty for years, you need to decide exactly what questions you're going to ask them. Obviously, I think in the UK, for example, we said, well, what does a child of your age need to have a kind of a normal kind of a life? That was the way we put it. Well, of course, some children then think about being loved by their parents, for example, or having good friends, and so on and so forth. So you can quickly get into a rather large debate about where the boundaries of poverty are. And I'd be interested to know, I don't have the answers, but Dave and Shailen, how you can kind of place some kind of a boundary around the discussion without also kind of restricting people's views, because it's important to hear different views. They're often very different to the kind of theoretical perspectives we might have on these things. But I would say the approach we took in the UK was probably closest to the Townsend approach about social exclusion. So those are some comments particularly about data collection. I can say that we worked with children at some point as young as 8 years old in various countries to develop this for international use. And I certainly believe that you can have discussions with children from that age, probably younger, on these issues. Shailen, you said that there is scope to include children, but I would argue much more strongly that it's an imperative, particularly if UNICEF are going to be involved. Children have their own perspectives on this, and I don't think we can really define how they experience poverty without asking them. So I would hope that UNICEF will ensure that children are always involved in these discussions. But that does lead to a challenge, and moving a little bit away from data collection, is that children and adults may not agree. And so when we talk about consensus, in any case, I don't think we're really talking about the dictionary meaning of consensus, which means everyone agrees. And of course, that's never going to happen. But what if there's profound non-consensus between, for example, adults and children? Now, I'll give you an example. In the UK, we worked very hard with children to come up with the best list of 10 items, did a survey, validated it, lots of testing and so on. One of the items was having a cable or satellite television at home. And children regarded this as poverty if you didn't have it in the UK context. And then we presented our results and our index to a group of poverty researchers at a seminar, and they completely rejected this idea that that could possibly be part of a poverty measure. Now, I don't know what the general public thought, but I can tell you that the adults in the room simply wouldn't accept it. And we tried to explain that the reason children said it was because at that time, if you didn't have that, then when you went to school, all the other children were talking about TV programs that you couldn't watch. And so those children felt socially excluded, which is the Townsend definition. And I think from that point of view, within the UK context at that time, it was a valid item to use. But adults reacted very strongly against the idea that this could be poverty. So I do think there's going to be a challenge as we broaden out the discussion, involve children and adults, those kind of debates and how we balance that out with the consensual approach. I can see that I'm already taking quite a bit of time, so I'm not going to be able to cover all my points. I think I'll move on to one other key issue, I think, which is that I really think it would be wonderful to have a valid international measure. The experience from the second project I mentioned, the Children's Worlds, is it's going to be a real challenge once you broaden out the range of countries in terms of wealth. So, Shailen, you showed broad agreement between 5 countries within one geographical region, and I can understand that that's going to be possible. There are 2 issues with aiming higher than that for a much more global thing. The one thing is that the 8 items we used in the Children's World Survey, in Finland, almost no children lacked any of those items. So there were, on the other hand, for example, in Bangladesh, more than half the children, I can't remember the figures, but there was substantial deprivation. And so it is going to be really tough to get a scale that works across all those countries, but also a scale that it really warrants the name consensual, because what's, in agreement in one country is not necessarily something that people in another country will agree with. Now, I can see, again, you managed it in West Africa, but I'm not sure if you'll manage that level of agreement when you go more global. Nevertheless, I think it's a fantastic initiative, and I'd love to see it work. It may be, and something we concluded from the work we did in these 35 countries, you may actually need to kind of overlapping scales that have some common ground in the middle, but are maybe more adapted to low income and high income contexts, because having a single scale, I think, if that's the intention, unless I've misunderstood, it is going to be tough. I think to leave time for questions, because I'm sure lots of other people on the call will also have very important points to make. I'll leave it at that. I mean, as I say, I'm really positive about what you're attempting to do, but I think there are challenges ahead involving children, getting their agreement with adults, cross-cultural agreement, and so on. It's a big project, but yeah, I wish you success, and I'd love to be involved in it in some way. So, thanks.
Thank you, Gwyther. I loved your points about the imperative to include children, and also to take into account the role of the qualitative part, the focus groups and other ways, which is part of the data collection besides the actual questions. The floor is open in case there are further questions. There is one here for Shailen, which in my computer just jumped around, so I cannot read it anymore. Here it is. Based on the findings, can we converge to a common approach as the unsatisfied basic needs using a consensual approach? That's one question. I'm just trying to read if the other one is a comment or a question. Yes. So the question is there, I think, Dave, you can answer, or any of the three of you could answer, actually. There is not much of an issue with different methods of data collection given the silk comparison. The question is, does this take into account the extreme differences there are in how silk questions are implemented by countries with many or many more variable ones? So those are the two questions, plus Gwyther's comments. We have about 2 minutes. I know, Gwyther, you have to leave. We'll try to not overrun 5 past or something like that, given that Attila said we have about an hour. Over.
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes,
Dave,
please, Shailen, go ahead.
Okay. I mean, I don't mean this as a glib response to Gwyther's very important point about differences between adults and children, and particularly on cable cable TV, for example. I mean, I would love to ask those adults after lockdown with COVID as to whether or not they think Netflix is an essential necessity or not going forward. But I mean, yes, these are all things that are best ironed out at the country level. Not applying a standard, what worked for us will definitely work there. And that's why we use these focus groups, these discussions that are then had to shape the items that we then ask about. But over the period of 30, 40 years where we've been asking these questions, we do see agreements and commonalities. There has been less work about asking children directly. And I think you and Jill and Jonathan's work was leading on that in sort of really getting the direct voices of children in there. But I still think that a lot of the things, it's not that it's linking back to the adaptive preferences issue as to whether or not we should include things. I think what is important and what people are likely to agree on is already pretty much settled. It's looking at that enforced lack that really will tell us about the poverty side of things. We can continue to ask why people think what constitutes poverty. I think we know that after 200 years of research. It's not the what that we need to know, it's the levels of deprivation that we're still interested, and then driving down to look at what relates directly to children, as opposed to in their own right, as opposed to subsets within a household. I mean, the issue of comparing high and low income countries, Dave is the expert with regards scale equivalence and the anchoring of scales, which I'll let him discuss. We always have this question. And Antonio, I'm just trying to see if the question that you asked, can we converge to a common approach used as the answer? Essentially, yes, I'm thinking. I mean, the approach that's used in the European Union, we're able to compare countries like Sweden with countries like Romania, a very, very different socioeconomic level there, but producing comparable indicators to compare those two countries against each other. Dave, could I hand that over to you for the anchoring elements?
Sure. I'll also just address some of Gwyther's very important questions. So I wasn't proposing, we've never proposed having an identical set of questions in all countries like they did in Children's World, because there's such vast differences in living standards and cultures. What you need is a core subset of questions which are asked everywhere, and then questions which are appropriate to those countries specifically. And if you've got a core subset of questions, then you can scale equate, just as we do with exams every year, to make sure that an A grade is the same as the year before, and the year before that, and a C grade is the same. So these are tried and tested techniques for asking different questions. You don't have the same questions in your maths exam or your history exam every year. You have a core set that's in common, and then you have extra questions, and you adjust you equate the test. So these things have been done for almost 100 years, and we know the statistics of them. The difference in consensus, well, as Gwyther said, there's very high agreement between parents and children, although there are some differences. There have been several surveys in different countries which have looked at this. In Hong Kong, children gave more weight to items to fit in with their friends, and parents gave more weight to items to help the children do better at school, such as extra lessons. I suspect that's fairly common around the world. In Fiji, we asked every adult and every child in the household was asked the questions, and the differences between adults and between children and within adults and within children were similar. But when you come to actually aggregating, you get very few differences. You get high levels of agreement. Well, the question about can you use SPNs to work with unmet basic needs? Luis Beccaria, who worked for ECLAC, measuring unmet basic needs for many decades. He worked with Altamir in developing these things originally, has been using socially perceived necessities questions, consensual deprivation methods, to supplement and complement the unmet basic needs in Argentina. That's been done in Argentina state and is likely to be rolled out across all of Argentina. And has improved the standard measures, unmet basic needs measures, in terms of the accuracy and reliability. The trouble is, as countries develop, such as Argentina has and other Latin American countries going from very poor to middle income, so the standard indicators which used to be used to measure very poor circumstances become less and less reliable, and they need to be supplemented. Were there any other questions? I've lost track.
I think I've answered the main ones, Dave. I'm also mindful of the time, and I would defer to Attila.
So there's one.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Dave. Go ahead.
Silk. So I just showed the mode of collection results from the Silk because this is about data collection, this webinar. But we ran 32,000 regression equations to see if there were differences by different population groups, by education level, by the job they did, by age, by gender, in all the 28 European member states, by sub-regions, and we found very few differences in what was considered necessities of life. There were some country-specific differences in Cyprus. People said it was not necessary to give their children 3 meals a day. They only give their children 2 meals a day. In Denmark, people rate much more keen on having meat in every single meal than in other parts of countries. But by and large, these are minor differences. You get a reliable and valid measure for all subgroups in all these societies with all their different languages and cultures. The reference Shailen gives goes into tedious detail about all these results, so you can see for yourself. It's not just across the European Union where this has been done, it's been done across the Pacific and in many Latin American and African countries and many Asian countries as well. Okay. Thanks. Enrique?
No, thank you, Dave. There is a side comment or side conversation about the possibility of having a few questions in a module that could be attached, for example, to DHS. Shailen has responded on the side. I would only add to that the efforts that you have been leading, Dave, on translating these questions to a wide variety of languages, and it's effort that is ongoing, and those questions are going to be available in the website that Shailen provided, which is hosted at the Bristol University. I want to say just one more word on that, and then I will defer to Attila, as we're already 5 minutes over the hour. Please,
yes.
Dave.
One of the key important development work is that the question should be available not just in English, but in a wide range of languages. And we're in the middle of producing translations using conceptual translations rather than literal translations done by national statistical offices, experts in them, so that the the essential deprivation questions will be available in 30 or 40 languages in the very near future and will be put on the web. So you'll be able to look at the question in English and see it in French, or Belgian French, or Haitian French, or German, or Spanish, or Italian, or whatever, or Chinese, or Russian, whatever language.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Gwyther had to leave, but thank both of you. Attila, go ahead.
we can go on to quarter past if there are more questions and points to be made. Enrique, and then Archana will wrap up.
Okay. Thank you, Attila. Now I see that your text message that said exactly the same thing. I didn't see, unless there's anything I am missing, I didn't see any other questions. I saw the comment by Bo about the possibility of doing some comparison with a handful, 5, 6, 7 mix that have used silk type questions, but I didn't see any other comments. If Archana or Attila, you see something that I am missing, please tell me.
There is a comment from Alicia Krubnik.
Okay, I didn't see it. Shailen, go ahead.
The question asked is, does the consensual method take into account, or can it be applied to a poverty measure that takes into account the distribution of deprivation?
Yeah. So you can aggregate the items into a scale and then look at the distribution of deprivation, either in the scale as a whole or in subscales for measuring education deprivation or food deprivation or clothing deprivation, and that's done routinely in the national reports that use this method. There was a very good example put in the chat of how it's being used in South Africa and being developed there.
Thank you, Dave. One last word maybe from you or Shailen on Bo's question about validity of the methods and the data collection evidence.
So the different types of validity, obviously, since it's a democratic measure, it only includes as a deprivation what the majority of the members of a population in any given society think are necessities of life, which everyone should be able to have. That means that it has high face validity. There has been, as part of the analytical framework I showed, a lot of work on criterion validity, looking at the correlation between each deprivation indicator and other indicators which are known to be good measures of poverty, low education level, the type of job, other types of deprivation which are known to be correlated with poverty. And we've shown, it can be demonstrated there's very high validity also with subjective measures of poverty, as Gwyther discussed, and as Shailen showed in his slides, Rod Hicks analyses.
Final question about an example of the statistical method used from a published article. I know that some of it is in the report that the European Union report that you showed, Dave, in your slides, and Shailen, you had 5 or 6 references. I think all of them address the statistical, but maybe you want to say more on that.
Sure. So the European work has been published in social indicators research and child indicators research, and there are numerous, literally several hundred articles from different countries of the world published in peer-refereed academic journals. So if you go to the Poverty and Social Exclusion website, you'll see a large number of references, and I can also provide you with them if you want.
Apologies, I didn't control for the font size, but I just copied and pasted from the last slide some of the material. Some of the Journal of the European Social Policy paper is also very detailed on the statistical approaches taken, and Nick Bailey's paper in Social Indicators Research and Rod Hicks' paper in Fiscal Studies are also both worth taking a look at. I think the final question is for Attila. I wish I could answer it.
Attila, you might want to skip it and then go to Archana directly.
I would rather skip it because I was in the process of writing my question in the chat box. But yes, this is something that we are considering without committing to anything at this point, because we're at a conjuncture when we are going from mix 6 to mix 7, and this is not only to do with this measure, but also with different topics and new indicators. So we are in a process of assessment on how we're going to go into Mix 7.
Yes, and if I can put a little grain of hope, yes, I actually think that having this sort of consensus introduced into the indicators and the thresholds that are used, as you put there, MODA, MPI, Bristol, they claim to use the same concept, they use the same methodology, but because of the difference in indicators and thresholds and cutoffs, we get wildly different numbers. And that is a problem. And having a way to validate through consensus that for each of the dimensions in which we're interested for multidimensional poverty, we know from people themselves, and I want to emphasize what Gwyther said, from children themselves, what are the elements that are really necessary? I really, really hope that I don't know if it's going to be solved forever, but certainly make a lot of headway to get much, much better measurements of poverty. Archana, you have a minute to wrap up.
Let me just can I just respond to Attila's
Yes,
question?
please.
Yes.
The difference in the reason for the widely different estimates is mainly due to differences in the thresholds in each indicator rather than the aggregation of each indicator. So whether you're using unimproved sanitation or open defecation makes a huge difference to the aggregated result. With the consensual method, you use the majority of the population's view to set the threshold. So whether you include the indicator or not, and therefore you get round the threshold problem, and therefore the widely different results.
Yeah, completely agree, Dave. But just to expand a little bit more on my question, it's all fine for us technical people to understand the differences, and we can resolve those differences among ourselves. But when you think of a policymaker, and when different poverty measures or approaches are producing estimates, or one would say there's no child poverty in your country, and the other says it's a big problem in your country, then that's a little bit confusing. And the eventual concept that everyone is promoting is exactly the same, multidimensional poverty. So it becomes a big problem in terms of the messaging and influence in the policy. I think there should be, and this includes UNICEF, there should be a position in terms of how we convey these results to the policymakers.
I agree entirely, and also if the aggregate measure is not valid and reliable, it's also highly problematic, because when the next survey comes along, you can get a widely different result, which is an artifact rather than necessarily a real change. So I agree with you. I think we need better data, and I think we need data where the threshold problem is not partially, at least partially solved. That's why we're proposing this idea.
Well, thank you so much. I think that was a really interesting way to sum up where we are with this. So I'd like to thank you both, Dave and Shailen, for a really great presentation and obviously stimulating discussion. And although Gwyther's not here, thank you for his contributions as well, and Enrique for chairing, which was great. So I'd like to remind you that we will be conducting these webinars on a bi-weekly basis. So the next one will be on the 18th of May, and it will be on children and ICT. And also just to remind you that the presentations will be recordings will be available on our SharePoint site, as well as on the Mix YouTube channel. So this has been a great start of the webinar series for spring, and we look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.